cultural appropriation. And then someone wrote to me a cultural appropriation clearance with his passport saying that it's okay for me to eat sushi and so on. And that resulted in a tsunami of people from all over the world sending me such cultural appropriation clearances, which I created a sad truth from it. And one of those people was yourself. At the time, I didn't know you were a true Swedish parliamentarian, but let me read your letter to the folks, because it was a fantastic one, written on actual letterhead from the Swedish parliament.
Yes.
And I think you had written in your tweet, it doesn't get more official than this. So, dear Mr. SAAD, by the power vested in me by the Swedish parliament and by the authority of the great people of Sweden, I hereby grant you the permission to watch Thor and or any Avengers movie, and but not excluding any of the subsequent sequels. I also grant you the right to raid villages wearing a horned helmet and the indefinite right to buy affordable furniture at IKEA, assembly of said furniture not included. Yours sincerely, Hanif Bali, Member of Parliament. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. I hope you use these rights.
And so when I first received it, I had no idea, sorry to say, who you were, but then tons of people wrote and said, oh, you guys need to speak to one another. So I'm truly thankful that we connected. And of course, I concede that your beard is much more majestic than mine.
This is the generation of Shia breeding that has resulted of this magnificent beard.
By the way, I had last week, you may or may not have seen, Imam Tawhidi, who is...
Yeah, I saw that talk, actually, yes.
Okay. So, okay, good. So I thought we would start by me asking a very, very open-ended question. What the hell is going on in Sweden, Hanif?
So, there's two answers to that question. The first answer is Sweden is doing better than ever in many areas. I mean, ordinary Swedes have low unemployment. The economy is strong. People are more highly educated than ever, and it's going great. And on the other hand, it's totally going to shit. And we're seeing problems that Sweden has never seen before. I mean, and it's not, it used to be some like inner city problems that all cities in some sense have, but now we're seeing these problems being propagated outside of these large cities like Stockholm or Malmö or Gothenburg. In Trollhättan, a small city in the west of Sweden, they had all out, ethnicity wars between Arabs and Somalis, for example. They were burning tires. I remember when I read the news of burning tires, and it got me thinking of Black Hawk Down, the movie where they burn tires so the helicopters won't see them. These are forms of violence and problems that the Swedish society is not built to handle, and have not been, mentally prepared to address.
Now, so can we confirm that there are many areas in Sweden that are what is colloquially referred to as no-go zones, where if you are likely to be an indigenous sort of white, blonde-haired person, you may not have a very happy existence there. Is that true?
It doesn't need to be because you're blonde. I mean, of course you can meet harassment, but the main issue is that it's more because it's so high crime, and the gangs, the street gangs, has taken over the physical control in some sense of these areas. Police can't operate normally. The mail services can't operate normally. Even the meter maids can't operate normally, and therefore they are called no-go zones. So it's usually areas where they have very high unemployment, very high amount of immigration, very low number of people turning out for a vote, for example. All these key issues are usually describing area which has, socioeconomic difficulties. Out of these, about 180 areas with socioeconomic difficulties, more than 20 to 30 of them have huge issues where they are, colloquially called no-go zones. In Sweden, they're called utsatta områden, and it means, areas that are, having a hard time.
Or areas that are being culturally enriched. That's also another important.
Well, that's one way of putting at it. And one big issue that is, being ignored is actually the issue that culture has, the impact that culture has on these areas. And may I say, for example, the gang cultures. It's usually not, the culture that people has brought with them from Iraq or Syria or something like that. It's usually Swedes, usually immigrants that come to Sweden in large numbers, in so large numbers that the Swedish society cannot assimilate or integrate them either socially or in the economy. You get extreme poverty and segregation. And what happens that these kids, they don't see themselves as Swedes. And when they return to Iraq or Syria, they don't, are not considered Iraqi or Syrian. And therefore they start seeking a new identity. And they find this new identity either, becoming religious zealots, or this is of course I'm being generalizing a little here, or de facto turning into ghetto crime, street culture and violence.
But now, Sweden, and I guess at some point we'll talk about sort of the open door immigration policy of Sweden. But I'm assuming that Sweden is generous in its open door policies to immigrants of all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all religions. And yet, are there, for example, any stats that suggest that the crimes that you're speaking of might be clustered around one particular unifying theme? So, for example, are there really nasty Vietnamese gangs running around or Haitian gangs?
The problem with Swedish immigration system is that it's, an open door policy for everybody, but not everybody, comes through the door.
Right.
So we're actually having, from being a very heterogeneous, immigration in the 90s and the 80s to Sweden, we're even more homogeneous immigration. Basically, you don't need to have too many, translators. They only need to, know Arabic or Dari. Basically, the biggest groups that are coming in now is Afghanis and Arabs. So therefore, you can't specifically say that. We have problems with gangs, for example, more of a mafia structure, criminality with the Assyrians that are Christians. But we have also problems with, for example, a lot of gangs in Muslim-dominated areas. But the issue is that the situation has become so dire in a lot of these suburbs that religion is a form of saving your kid from the streets. Because now the people, the first generation immigrants are actually, they're very worse off than Swedish born, of course. But when we look at the second generation immigrants in these areas are even worse off than their parents. So what their parents actually has the choice of, should I put my kid in public schools and let them become thugs, or do I put them in pious religious schools and let them, get disciplined, but with an Islamic profile?
Right.
So these parents are actually stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we're actually seeing a lot of stats showing that people are becoming more religious than their parents' generations.
I think you find it in a lot of Western countries where there's big Islamic immigration. I don't think it's specific only to Sweden, correct?
No. You see, I don't have the stats, but I know, for example, from England that the second generation is even more pious or conservative, and with the full spectrum of that, of course, than the first generation.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And you'll also see differences between groups. For example, the Iranians are doing very well in Sweden. Many of them are not religious, and they're doing very well. They're actually doing more well. The second generation Iranians are doing more well than the Swedes, which is, you know, happy news, of course. But you also see a lot of people, if you look at the educational background of the immigrants that are coming in, are groups that Sweden have not, you know, we didn't have these form of low educated people in about 100 years. So therefore, the Swedish system has, you know, in some sense, is not prepared for these kind of issues. If you look at, for example, the immigrants that are coming in now, about 50% of them has less than 9 years of schooling. About 30% have less than 6 years of schooling. 70% of women have never worked a single day in their entire life. And they come to Sweden where about 80% of women work.
Right.
And people have, I mean, and if you don't have a high school degree, you're basically screwed. Right. And they come into to a society like that, and of course they're going to be poor. Of course they're not going to be able to compete in the labor market. And it used to be a huge taboo in Sweden to even say that the number of migrants coming in has some form of affection of in our ability to integrate and assimilate people.
Now, okay, but got all that. What is it in Sweden? So what is it in the psyche of the collective Swedish mindset that makes them not unique? Because I think ultimately much of the West is succumbing to what I call ostrich parasitic syndrome. But there is something unique in Sweden, which of course our current prime minister in Canada is trying to now outdo and go ahead of Sweden as the most castrated country in the West. But until our new prime minister came along, we could have said, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that Sweden was sort of the king or queen of all of the castrated Western countries, in the sense that they have truly succumbed to a collective suicidal form of political correctness that's difficult to comprehend. I mean, not even my brightest satire could keep up with the Swedish lunacy. So what is it that explains it? Is it that the Swedish have viewed it as part of their identity, that they are virtuous signalers who despise racism, and therefore that's the only lens by which they view the world? I mean, is it as simple as that? Is that the issue?
So if you look at Sweden, first of all, you have the consensus culture. This is a very homogeneous society. And not anymore in that sense, but it used to be just 30 years ago, a very homogeneous society. And you have a consensus culture where anybody that has a different opinion outside of what is the norm is being cast out and burned out. And you don't even need to, you know, be explicit about it. This happens implicitly. And that's the first key
so
issue.
Immigration is good, and this is our official position. If you are against it and you express your individuality, therefore you must be a racist bigot because you're getting outside the collective.
So then somebody like me comes along, which came as an unaccompanied refugee to Sweden, and says that, hey guys, you know, the numbers do not, you know, stack up, and it you know, if you take in 2 immigrants per school, they're going to be, you know, socializing with Swedes and are going to end up like Swedes. But if you have 200, that's not going to happen. And therefore they have the issue where they can't call me a racist. I mean, that was the main tool that both media and public and politics and the public had in its disposal, is calling people racist. So you can't. It's very hard to call me a racist. So what they did is instead brand me as a, you know, a house nigger, Uncle Tom, and all these forms of racial slurs that they have been using have been undermining their own, virtue signal in some sense.
Who calls you that, by the way? Is it your Swedish politician colleagues? Is it the media?
Oh, yeah.
Is it the ethnic communities? All of them.
All of them.
Okay.
All of them. It's the civil society that gives the image of representing the immigrants. You have religious organizations. You have public figures. Op-ed writers. You name it. All of them, in some sense. All of each group, but. If what happened was we actually in a couple of years ago in 2013 a Swedish program, a debate program, asked all the politicians how much immigration can Sweden take. That was the question, and the people didn't accept even the basis of the question. It was a huge debate in Sweden how racist that question is.
It should be unlimited. To ask that question implies racism because it implies that there should be a limit.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that even if there shouldn't be a limit, that there exists a limit. Right. Even that was considered racism until 2015, when we actually found out the number of where the number of immigrants Sweden physically can accept. We had huge problems in 2015, in late 2015, where even the Greens, the most liberal, the most open-minded, non-racist party, they were in power with the Social Democrats, which is also, bearer of the, virtue signaling. Even they went out and said that, okay, we can't take it anymore. We're gonna, restrict the immigration laws. And what happened was the entire consensus shifted. Totally, suddenly everybody was saying, "Oh, this is always my opinion, that there is a limit to. Nothing has changed." It's like in an airplane, when you make a loop and just twist the airplane, you can say, "I never changed direction. I was just flying straight ahead," And that's what's happened, and this is one of the reasons why Swedes, I believe, don't believe in that there is actually a limit, is that the environmental argument of how much people are, how much society and policy can change the environment of people, and therefore people are only slaves of their environment, is so dominating in the thought of the left and the Swedish mind. So people say, well, there's no limit to immigration, it's just a limit of how good integration policy we can have.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say this, because what you're talking about really smells of what's called the blank slate premise, which is very much something within my scientific work, which is something that I've battled in my academic career. So the blank slate premise basically says that we're all born with empty minds, right? Tabula rasa. And it's only a question of the appropriate socialization that will make me turn into Lionel Messi or a beggar or a criminal or a scientist. And I think Sweden, as you correctly pointed out, and I've discussed this even in my scientific work, is sort of one of the key proponents of this sort of collective social engineering program, right? The idea, for example, that, we should get rid of gender pronouns. By the way, Sweden scores the highest of all countries that are scored by Geert Hofstede's cross-cultural study on masculinity, femininity. Sweden scores the highest on femininity of every known culture. And incidentally, when I'm talking about the biological roots of toy preferences, I cite a study that was done in Sweden where they inventoried toys of boys and toys of girls in Sweden. And guess what? Their toy preferences were no different than the toy preferences documented in every other culture, despite the fact that they've been doing 40 years of, gender eradication engineering.
So this is one of the, I mean, interesting. I mean, I believe you have seen the research of Baron Cohen, where he look at 1 day old babies, where they have precisely the same preferences. So this gender paradox is kind of interesting, because when Sweden is becoming one of the most, egalitarian societies in the world, we're seeing more and more gender differences, and we're seeing people being more traditional in their way of choosing, which occupations they should.
You're talking about the indigenous Swedes, or you're including the ethnic immigrants who already have clear gender segregation? Which ones do you mean?
For the most immigrants that come here, the issue is not what what occupation I should get. It's more, can I even get an occupation? So it's not. So if you look at the differences, if you look at the differences between, especially those who came through asylum, not Norwegians or Danes who came here, especially those who came through asylum systems. If you look at the differences between occupation between Swedes and non-Swedes, it's extremely high. I mean, it's the biggest in the entire industrialized Western world. The reason of it, of course, is because we have the largest differences between educational background.
Right.
I mean, there's a test called PISA. I don't know if you had a huge So there's also a test for PISA for grown-ups, which is called PAAC. And PAAC looked at, for example, immigrants. The average immigrant performs in mathematics and in language skills about the same in the same interval that the worst 10% of Swedes do.
Can I answer that now as a castrated Swede? Can I answer that result? That's because those tests are racist and do not recognize our unique cultural reality. If you gave us the appropriate test, then we would score the highest.
Yeah.
No, but that's literally what would be said, correct?
That's one interesting thing. Which, I mean, one big, we kind of strayed off gender here, which we're discussing, but I want to make this point, is that one interesting thing is that when you measure immigrants that perform in the same, that get the same grade in this test as immigrants and Swedish born, if you look at these two groups, you see zero difference in employment. So if they perform the same on mathematics, reading, and problem solving, they get employed exact same. So this goes, against all this common belief and common issue that it is discrimination. That is the only reason why immigrants in Sweden are being segregated, economically segregated. It's, of course, you can't deny some level of discrimination, but to accept the idea that segregation in Sweden is caused by racism, you have to accept the idea that Sweden is the most racist country in the world. And which is in itself preposterous, because in every other test we do, we're not.
I was in Norway back in 2013, giving a few talks in Oslo, and I was speaking to at least one gentleman, but I think this theme arose with several people, where I was asking him, so how is the integration of the immigrants been in Norway? And usually the answer was a form of self-flagellation that you typically see across the West, but I think that the Scandinavians have mastered. You hit yourself, kind of like the Shia Ashura thing, right? And it turns out, according to their cancerous mindset, that the reason why these immigrants were not doing well is precisely because of how racist the indigenous people were, right? Yeah. So at no point, as a matter of fact, even things like, which I'd like to talk about next, the rape epidemic. By the way, I've now, because of the political correctness, I think we should change the term from rape to undocumented lover. It's more inclusive and diversified and so on. So I wanted to ask you, as we jump to this next thing, is it true that there is a problem of undocumented lovemaking in Sweden that has arisen as a result of the immigration wave, or is this just Trump who is spreading lies about honorable Sweden?
We don't know.
Why is that?
Because there's no stats. We have the last time was many years ago now. I was in high school, I believe, where we got stats not based on ethnicity. I mean, we're not demanding ethnicity stats. Nobody's demanding that. We're just looking at what stats through citizenship. What is their citizenship? And we just want see the statistic broken down and when last time you had a huge over representation of certain groups. I remember the North Africans were very overrepresented in rapes that was some form of assault. Right. But the true answer, the answer I can give you, I don't like to talk about things I don't know.
Sure.
The only answer I can give is that we don't know, and the reason why when we say we want these stats, the government says, well, our agencies, they're independent. They can release the stats if they need to. And agencies are telling us, well, we can release the stats if the government compels us to do it. So you have Moment 22 where the stats are not being publicly available, which is strange because they used to do it. But now they say like, oh, it's only socioeconomical reasons why we're finding overrepresentation. For example, in gang crime, for example, that we have stats on, you see that in the gang shootings, 90% are immigrants.
Right.
90%, and immigrants are about 16% of the population. So you can see that there is a huge overrepresentation, but this is all being covered up. That this is all socioeconomical, and because it's socioeconomical, there's no reason to publicly make these stats available. It doesn't matter. It could be a Swede. It could be a Viking Swede, only if he was in that socioeconomic state. But the problem, what they're ignoring, is that if you have that form of immigration, you're going to have more people in that form of socioeconomic. So even if it was 100% socioeconomical reason, which is not, we're still seeing overrepresentation, even if you make corrections for socioeconomic causes. But even if it were so, immigration creates a new socioeconomic class.
Right. But just
it's being ignored.
I just want to make sure that because I've heard two versions of the story. I've heard sort of the traditional Swedish apologia version, and I'm not suggesting that you're doing this, but that basically says, well, we don't know any of the undocumented lovemaking stats because we don't have these stats, and yet
we don't publicize.
Okay, because I've also seen studies that cite stats, let alone the daily articles in reputable newspapers that document gang rape here, gang rape there, rape here, rape of children, rape. Sorry, I said rape. I meant undocumented lovemaking. And how do I reconcile these? Because I could probably pull out for you 10 links right now from reputable sources that suggest that there is a massive problem, but then how do I reconcile that with, but we're not really sure because we haven't analyzed the stats.
Everything is indicating in some sense that we have a much larger problem now. For example, gang rapes of boys.
Yes.
This was of course it happened sometime, but it wasn't something commonly. It was extremely uncommon. But in the last 2 years or 3 years where we had huge numbers of Afghanis coming to Sweden, and with the Bachabazi culture that existed of course these crimes has been risen a lot, but the problem is that I can't with scientific certainty, I can't with scientific quote you the actual number.
I admire your conservative.
Not because we don't have the data.
Yeah.
We have the data, but when I, as a parliamentarian, demand these data from the government, they deny them to me.
And they don't give them to you undoubtedly because if that data were properly digested, processed, and advertised, it would shatter the utopic myth of how beautifully everything is happening, correct? I mean,
Right.
what would be the other? I mean, more information is always better when you are discussing public policy making. So what would be
the reason they say they won't publicly is because they want to. It can be used by racists, right? This information will be used by racists, and the racist will win.
Right.
But the problem is the exact same. This behavior is actually what's making the racist guys grow, because if you create an environment where you suppress speech, the speech goes underground and it festers and it comes out even worse. So if you look at like alternative news sites, I mean, they're propaganda pieces, right? I'll tell you, the mainstream media is also in some sense propaganda pieces in many times, but much less in some sense than many of these alternative news sources. But the problem is that if the only way people are going to find out who is the assailant that is roaming free in a certain neighborhood is to go into these sites,
right?
People will do that, and they will take the red pill, and you won't get them back.
Right.
So instead of being careful with this information and using it properly with non-racist but a good intent, we suppress it.
But isn't now Sweden? So two points I want to make about this. First, I think it was Stockholm police, or I don't know if it's a national police in Sweden, that now no longer identifies, say, rapists and so on. They leave that very vague, precisely under the argument of what you said, because that might trick.
This has actually changed in later years. The police are going out with images. Have you seen this guy, for example? And they go out with the media with images and a detailed description of the person.
But his name is Muhammad Ahmad Hussein, but they change it to Sven Ringqvist.
No, this doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is when the media publicize a person that is wanted, right? Have you seen this guy from a CCTV capture? The media pixelates.
Right.
I mean, so there is a standing joke now. Have you seen these 4 pixels walking around in the streets of Stockholm? So this is actually, the media takes it upon itself to be the kind of good censor.
Right.
And the reason I believe this creates even more animosity and racism.
Right.
Because
go ahead. Finish your point.
That is I believe this will shift also. I mean, you can't uphold these in a free open society. You can't uphold this kind of censorship for too long until you'll have consequences, and we're all already seeing these consequences. So the Swedish Democratic Party, which is a populist.
This is I have his name. Is it Kent Ekeroth? Is that?
Oh yeah, Kent is one of their public figures, right?
Okay.
Right. So the Swedish Democratic Party has now grown from being one of just a couple of thousand votes to now being the second largest opposition party.
Okay.
So this has, my party has imploded because they've been taking from the right and also from the left voters, and we're having an issue now where the political stability, the ability to form governments, as being affected because of this growth of this party. And the common explanation you get when you talk to people is that this is because suddenly in the matter of 4 years, Swedes has gone from, the number of racist Swedes has gone from 0.6% to 20%. Right. And the idea of this is of course absurd. And we have to realize that how the political establishment, and my own party included, my own party was, and myself, when I started as a freshman in politics, I was under the same delusions as I criticize today. And this is, you learn this because it's a consensus culture. You learn from older politicians and the people you look up to how to do politics. And what we have to realize that the strategy with that the public, the Swedish public has chosen is faulty and wrong, and people are kind of slowly coming to grasp with this.
So is there I'm going to ask you in a second one more question about the Swedish police, but since we're on the point of politics, is there a figure in Swedish politics that's coming up that would be akin to the phenomenon of Brexit, Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, someone who, and this is not an issue, or he's extreme right, or he's a Nazi. I don't like this kind of...
Populist figure really gaining momentum.
Populist figure, breaking through the political correctness clutter, speaking openly and honestly, definitely not a racist, but who says, as exactly you said, look, you can't integrate 200 kids who have completely different cultural backgrounds into a small school. So is there someone at the national level, I mean, beside yourself, so that you have a critical mass of people who might wake up the sort of the ethos of the Swedes?
More and more so. Okay. More and more so, because there has been kind of this war from some form of the intellectual rights against the left of, some of the dogmas that has been existing, that you may not speak about this. And this kind of intellectual groundwork is now, in some sense, bearing fruit also in the parliament, where people from the right to the left are more able to speak openly and more candidly about these issues. So I'm always optimist, so this is a fault of mine, but I'm seeing more of an open discussion now than I saw for 4 years ago.
Oh, that's good.
But in the same sense, we're having an extreme polarization, and we're also seeing the rise of the Sweden Democrats.
Right. Now, when I mentioned his name, when I mentioned Kent, Ekeroth's name, you had a bit of a reaction. Do you want to?
Yeah. Kent Ekeroth sat next to me in Parliament. We shared the same bench for 4 years in that. He's not a figure that gets people together. He's more of an outlier even in his own party of the Swedish Democrats, and right now has some assault charges actually hanging over him. He's a very controversial figure, and is not, I wouldn't call him in some sense a Macron or a Le Pen or a
is it because of his rhetoric? Is it his rhetoric that's polarizing, or his personality or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. But I mean, in some sense, I'm a divisive figure too. I mean, you either love me or hate me in Swedish politics. There's not so many people that just shrugs in my existence. So but we're seeing something in politics right now where people are just desperate of somebody having a genuine opinion.
Right.
I usually say this. So when Hillary spoke, you didn't know if it was Hillary that was speaking, or if it was the focus groups and the PR firms, and then they all filtrated into words that she is now pronouncing. But when Donald Trump is saying crazy things, nobody can deny it's Donald Trump that says and believes those things.
I've made that exact point in many different forums, and of course I must be a neo-Nazi for saying that. It's just unbelievable the amount, the extent to which political correctness can confine people, right? I mean, you typically think about somebody being confined. They're confined in a physical space, right? You're a death row person. You're in a small 7x8 cell. But actually, maybe without pushing the analogy too far, a greater and more brutal form of confinement is the confinement that comes with your inability to ever express, as you correctly said, a single thought. And regrettably, I inhabit that world, and it's called academia, right? Right? You would think, I mean, politicians are disastrous, right? But then that's fine, because they're, with all due respect, most of them are scums who are playing to the public. But in academia, we're supposed to be the folks who have the intellectual ability, if not the intellectual courage, to take on difficult ideas and discuss them and debate them and come to some conclusion. And yet no place do you find greater intellectual cowardice than in academia. And so one of the things that I try to always compel my colleagues, because I'm in academia, not in politics, is just speak out, just utter a word, just pronounce a position. And I can't even get them, as I've mentioned many times, to even like one of my Facebook posts, right? I mean, never mind taking a position openly on a show that's viewed by millions of people. They won't even like a post that is on my personal page, even though privately they tell me that they love the positions that I take. So what is it that can get both politicians, academics, and the rest of the public out of this confinement, Hanif?
So what I've, my experience is overwhelming evidence and never giving up. So I'll tell you one example which was bizarre. So I've as an accompanied refugee,
Tell us about this before you start. What? Because you keep referring to that. Maybe you could tell us very briefly about your personal history.
When I was 3, my parents sent me to Sweden.
Wow.
So they sent me to Sweden. I'm raised up in kind of with Sweden as my parent, as my legal guardian. And I lived in foster homes, mostly of Iranian. I lived in a Swedish family where I could experience, they had jobs and I could experience Christmas and stuff for a couple of months. And then the Swedish social services changed me to an unemployed, newly arrived Iranian family because, I have to, I can't betray my culture and my religion, etc. So this is. And so I lived in a lot of these families. So
why didn't your parents come with you? Why didn't your parents emigrate?
Because there were Marxists, Islamists fighting against the Iranian regime.
And are you in touch with them now?
Yeah, I'm in touch. So my mother's out of this extreme sect, and my father is still with them.
I see. Okay. All right. Go on.
Yeah, but we talk once a year, something like that. So I've been raised up. So this is an issue very close to my heart. And I remember when I was in a home. This was kind of a collective home for us. And I was 10, and the oldest guys were 15. And it was kind of a huge clash to be raised up with that age difference, right? But now we had a huge problem of people coming to Sweden saying, hey, I'm 16 years old. Right. Everybody was 16. Especially the Afghani group. It was about 90% were 16. This was a unique word that only were,
And they looked like me, right? They were 16 and they had the gray beard.
And a lot of them were older. And we knew that they were, it's not logical. If you look at the Syrian group, there was very many different age groups, but the Afghanis were all 16. It was kind of a war only, affecting 16-year-olds. And we said like, hey, people are apparently cheating with this. And this is an issue very close to my heart, you know. I really suffer for the kids that have this faith. And the problem is like people are, you know, misusing this opportunity, this openness, this compassion. So, but it was the most racist thing you could say, that people are lying and that people are misusing a system, and that you need to test them.
Because all brown people are honorable people, right? It's the noble myth, the noble savage myth, correct?
So I mean, the reason I mean, I've been compared to Dr. Mengele. Because I wanted to have age tests. So what happened, I remember I was sitting in a dinner with the most liberal and the most, you know, immigration friendly, the spokesperson of that party's, and she actually openly told me, you know, I know they cheat. I know there's a lot of misuse, and I know, but I can't say it openly.
Wow.
And I said, well, I'm saying it, asshole. I'm saying it, and I'm taking all the heat because you're not saying it. If enough people are saying it, people will accept this. And we eventually came to the point after, you know, scandal after scandal of rape crimes in these homes, where the Swedish government have taken responsibility for 13-year-old kids being raped by 24, 25, 26-year-old males that are pretending to be kids. After scandal after scandal, suddenly it became too obvious, and we started to do age testing.
So imagine you literally are taking as sacrifices innocent children and giving them at the altar of political correctness as a sacrifice. I mean, that's literally the case, right?
Yes, literally.
It's unbelievable.
So this was, and now we're doing it, and the reason why you have to understand is there weren't only a kind of, you point out you know, animosity against age testing in the media. It was in the politics, in the media, even with doctors, scientists, in our government agencies. Everybody was, you know, having a, you know, standing on the wall, keeping this back.
Right.
Everybody. And all of them, of course, ethnic Swedes that are far away from the problems, living in their, you know, segregated, very wealthy neighborhoods. And while 13-year-old Afghani boys that are the most vulnerable you can actually find in our society are being raped. And this has, you know, this of course has, I mean, and people now that we're doing age testing, and we have on document people calling it racism and Nazism and you name it. And when we're calling him out, like, how can you now defend this position and say, oh, it was a different thing then? I mean, I never changed opinion, actually. I always believe that you have to have some form of testing, of course. But when I called you Dr. Mengele for you know,
it was a misunderstanding
because you wanted to test teeth, I wanted to test bone structure, you know, there's
a measurement problem. It was a measurement problem lost in translation. Speaking of rape, I wanted to mention what I said earlier about the Swedish police. The Swedish, I think it was Stockholm, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, came out with a truly brilliant plan. I thought this was fantastic policing. They thought that if the indigenous Swedish women would wear bracelets that say very strongly, "Don't touch me," this would stop the undocumented lovers from actually touching them. And then they were quite surprised that the noble brown people did not take those bracelets very seriously. Could you comment on that for us, please?
So this was kind of a information campaign, because it was a huge scandal and some, whispers of cover-ups were festival here in Stockholm, just 200 meters away from where I sit, a festival that is for youngers, 16-year-olds.
Music festival, correct?
Music festival. Yeah. And there was huge problems of, these gangs just groping girls. And the reason, so then you have to go back. What is the reason why a person does this? Well, it's because he's uninformed of this is a wrong thing to do. I mean, the terror in the girl's eyes is not enough to convince you. You have to inform these people that this is a wrong thing to do, and which is, of course, bullshit. Everybody knows it's wrong. It's that you don't give a shit.
Well, actually, there have been several judges in several places in Europe that have either dismissed a case or given a very light sentence when the defense was precisely that due to cultural misunderstanding, the guy didn't know that sodomizing a 10-year-old boy was frowned upon in that culture. I mean, how am I supposed to know this? You got to teach me this stuff, right?
So it's actually, this is a principle in Swedish law that not knowing the law is not an argument. This is a very
you can't use it as an argument.
No, you can't use it.
Okay.
But I've seen it being used.
Right.
I've seen it being used. But the reason also, they found that, it's just cultural issues, they're uninformed, we can inform people, but that's not how culture works. The only way you can get people out of their norms and cultural norms is to make them socialize and assimilate into other norms. That's the only way. You can't give them a flyer and they read it and that. And the problem is, with the amount of immigrants we're having, it's impossible to achieve this. It's impossible. It's the example I did. If you have 2 kids in a school, they will assimilate. If you have 200 kids in the school, they will go on with the same culture that they had before they came. Right. I don't believe that people are forever, condemned to have the norms that they were brought up with. Of course, people change, but you have to be in a social environment where that's even possible. The Swedish, political correctness and the logic behind it, even destroys the milieu you have to create for changing people's norms. So what happened was, which was very interesting, they were talking about toxic masculinity, and we have to have intersectional panel discussions before every festival, and I was like, seriously, do you think this is gonna work? And one interesting thing, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a Swedish rock festival. All evil, non-intersectional white rock men that are sexist. And there weren't a single case of sexual harassment.
Right, exactly.
Not a single case.
Well, they hadn't taken their toxic masculinity juice that morning. That's why. By the way, I saw this. There was I don't know if it was a play or some collective lunacy somewhere in Stockholm where these Swedish feminists were doing fake horse riding.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're riding the patriarchy.
That was very funny. Yeah, it was part of it.
That was not satire, right? That was true, right?
Yeah, it was a kind of a dance group, I believe, doing, taking back the public space.
Yes.
And therefore, you had groups of women galloping around like horses.
And so because the patriarchy comes on the horse, I guess, correct? Is that the idea?
Yeah, it was kind of a symbol of these old kings we have on horses.
Right.
In statues of them around in Sweden. So this was kind of some cultural some art installation.
Nice. Let's move from the undocumented lovemaking and some of the other issues we've talked about to Malmo. I hear that the Jews in Malmo are having a rough go at it. Maybe you could tell us why that's happening.
So this is an issue that I've been, discussing for a long time now, where you're actually having exodus of Jews out of Malmö. It's not safe to wear a kippah or a Star of David in Malmö. And Malmö is a very unique city in that sense. The Swedish, we had a program in the 60s and the 70s called the Million Program, where we're going to build 1 million apartments. And what happened was it started in Malmö. So in Malmö, the ghettos in Malmö, where there's only immigrant-born immigrants or people born of immigrant parents living. These are not like in Stockholm, out in a satellite somewhere far end in the subway, the end station of a subway system. They are more in the city. Okay, so therefore the impact on that city is much larger. And also Malmö is one of the most immigrant-dominated areas in Sweden. So this is a very interesting anti-Semitism in Malmö has a stronger foothold than Islamism.
Right.
You don't even need to be. I mean, to be an Islamist, you need to, go to the mosques and do all the. This is more common.
But the Jew hatred, just so that because I may not be progressive.
Mainly because of the immigrant. It's the immigrant population. Of course, you have a bunch of neo-Nazis, but that's not. They are not the guys who are making it unsafe for Jews.
And just because maybe some of our viewers might be confused, that immigrant population, they're usually what? Are they Amish, Seventh-day Adventists? I just want to know because I'm confused because I'm in academia, so I might not follow this nuanced language. They come from which religion? The ones who are strongest on Jew hate?
Muslim dominated and Arab origin. And this is, and I can say for myself, when I was brought up, I was brought up with a very negative sense of the word Jew was something negative that you called a friend that was behaving bad. Okay.
Thank you for your honesty.
This is and if you look at these areas where you're brought up, when the word Jew is something negative, of course, everybody is going to be brought up with, when they see actual Jew, of course, they're going to react negatively.
People don't appreciate, and I've mentioned it on several occasions in various forums, people don't appreciate how much people of that background are almost defined by their Jew hatred, right? I mean, you breathe oxygen, you breathe Jew hatred. It is a definitional element of your personhood. It's very difficult for most Westerners to understand this because in the West, the ethos of the West has consistently, the historical trajectory is to reject all this, right? We used to have slavery and racism, and now if you are a KKK guy, you're not invited to parties. It's ugly to be racist. It's ugly to be hateful. But imagine when you have a society that defines itself as a central part of its collective personhood as a Jew hater, right?
So if I look at murder threats, so the largest number of murder threats I get is when I speak out on issues of Jews and Israel.
Right. And
it's only immigrants. I mean, Arabic names.
Right.
People openly, I mean, with their own name on their Facebook page, threaten my life.
Wow. I noticed, by the way, right behind you, there is, this must be a mistake because you wrote Israel as, isn't there Israel in one of the envelopes? No, the other way. No, the other way. Don't you have, just on top of, to your right? Yes, right there, yeah. There seems to be a thing that says Israel.
Oh yeah, this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, so, you meant Palestine, right? Because Israel doesn't exist, right?
So I'm also the chairperson of the Swedish-Israeli Parliamentarian Friendship Association.
Oh boy!
That's why I get postcards. I mean, I'm still waiting for that Mossad money to my Swiss bank account.
I'll be sending it to you after today's.
I get murder threats and I only get a postcard.
So by the
this Jewish conspiracy, they're really not funding their, their foot soldiers.
That's how diabolical us Jews are. We promise you money, then we renege on the agreement. That's how evil we are, man. We don't honor contracts. But seriously, when you get all these death threats, you must give these to the police. Do they act on it, or is it?
Oh, not. I actually just I still report them, a lot of them, when I have the time to do it. But I found a very more effective method, and that. So if people gonna threaten me with their name, so I publicize. I just take a print screen of it and put it on my Facebook page and my Twitter, and all of my 120,000 followers can, on Facebook and Twitter can, see what kind of idiot, and it works, because when this guy that threatens me, in his life, the people around him, the norm is of course it's okay to hate Jews, and of course it's okay to, threaten a person that defends them. Of course it is. And if that's the norm, I have to show him another norm.
Right. Have you been able, in that particular engagement, have you ever been able to take one of these guys who sent you this type of hate and through some sort of engagement flip him around?
Yeah, actually happened. And one of the guys, he said, "Oh, please, can you take it down? People are, mailing me, and calling me and demanding what I mean. And please, can you take it down?" And I first of all started with, "Well, I don't want an apology. We can take the apology later. I need you to understand what you have done wrong." And I had a discussion with him. Where I said, "Hey, if somebody acted the way you're acting, and it wasn't a Jew, it was, because of Muslims or because of any other reason, would you find it acceptable?" Started to, reason with him and calm him down and reason with him. And suddenly we found that beautiful Swedish consensus.
It's so funny you say this, because I've had the exact same experience, where oftentimes people tell me, "Well, why do you waste your time engaging with random people and so on?" Well, because sometimes, small gains in the trenches matter, because other people are watching. I had a guy, a Muslim guy, I think he was from Lebanon, send me, I think it was a Saturday morning, I opened my private messages on Facebook, and it was, "I'm going to kill you," the whole thing. I started engaging him, and then I think I had done something similar to yours, where I had posted his stuff. He responded exactly like what the guy said to you, but he actually turned it into, he became the victim. Right?
Yeah.
He became the victim. Well, I mean, all I did was threaten to kill you, and now you go and you advertise this? What kind of monster are you? I mean, why can't you just gently die? Right? Yeah. But that, by the way, is the Islamic collective Munchausen, right? I attack, I threaten, I kill. When there is a retaliation, boo-hoo, I'm a victim, right? It's a classic.
But you can't get people out of it. What you do
and
is...
I got him out of it, just like you did yours. We ended up talking. I mean, we didn't become best of friends, and I haven't heard from him since that time. But I did something similar to you. So I really commend you on having the courage and patience to take on this guy. That's what we all should be doing.
Yeah. So I mean I see a lot of similarities from the things that are going on in Canada and Sweden, but we're kind of seeing that a single person can make a very big difference with the media platform. I mean, the work you're doing, and Jordan B. Peterson, of course, and it's also it doesn't stay in Canada. Right. I mean, it affects us here. So I am very optimistic.
So do you think? So let's, as we sort of come to the end of our chat, let's hopefully end it on some optimism. How do you see the trajectory of Sweden in particular, and more generally the West, playing out with all of these problems that we're facing?
So I see a shift in Sweden of more sensible, approach to a lot of these issues that we are discussing. There's a lot of work still left to do. I mean, I live in a community now in northern Stockholm with one of the most immigrant-heavy communities, but very well educated. And we're not seeing white flight. It's the only community not seeing white flight. And we're seeing kind of a very positive. People don't see it as multicultural. It's very immigrant populated, but it's not multicultural if people is not killing each other. Okay, so we're seeing kind of these positive examples, and we're also seeing popularity of people, confronting this truth, and we're now seeing people confronting political correctness that aren't batshit crazy.
Right.
It started with batshit crazy people doing it, right? Because of batshit crazy reasons.
Right.
But now we're seeing reasonable, logical, sensible people doing it, and those are those who are gaining traction. So I'm very optimistic for both Canada and Sweden.
From your lips to the cosmos's ear, as we say. Hanif, a true pleasure. I look forward to hopefully continuing our dialogue both online and offline. It was a real pleasure meeting you. And again, the best advice I can give to people is get engaged. You don't have to have a big platform. You don't have to be a Swedish politician. You don't have to be a professor. You could engage your friends in the bar. You could engage your friends on Facebook. Just participate in the battle of ideas and let the best ideas win, right?
I totally agree. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Stay on the line. Thank you so much, Hanif.